The door to the bridal chamber opened, and Alara's heart leaped into her throat. She had been sitting on the edge of the great canopied bed for nearly an hour, her ivory silk gown pooling around her like melted moonlight. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant murmur of the departing wedding guests had made her pulse flutter. She had rehearsed what she would say to him, how she would smile, how she would show him, even now, that she could be the wife he needed. But when Aldrich Ashford, the Duke of Thornwood, finally stepped inside, his face was carved from stone. He did not look at her as a husband looks at his bride. He did not cross the room with tenderness, nor pause to take in the candles she had lit herself. Hopping the soft glow would make the cold chamber feel like a home. He simply stopped near the door, one hand resting on the frame, and spoke with the precision of a man delivering a business decree. "This marriage is one of convenience. I will provide for you. I will protect your reputation, but I will not share your bed, and I will never love you. Do not expect warmth from me. You will not receive it." Then he turned and left, the heavy oak door closing behind him with a finality that echoed through Alara's bones. She sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap, the silk of her gown suddenly feeling like a costume she had no right to wear. The candles flickered. Somewhere deep in the manor, a clock chimed the hour. She did not cry. Not yet. That would come later, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the silence of Thornwood Hall pressed against her like a living thing, and she finally understood that her childhood dream had turned to ash. But in that first moment she simply whispered into the emptiness, "But you promised me once, under the stars, when I was 12 years old." There was no one to hear her. Alara Gray had not always been Alara Gray. She had been born Lady Alara Vance, the daughter of an earl who had once held lands that kissed the edge of the Thornwood estate. When she was 12, she had wandered too far into the forest during a hunting party and become hopelessly lost. Night had fallen, and she had curled beneath an ancient oak, trembling and certain she would never be found. It was then that a boy had appeared. He was perhaps 16, tall for his age, with dark hair and eyes that held a quiet intensity even then. He had found her, wrapped his coat around her shoulders, and stayed with her until dawn, telling her stories of constellations and promising that he would always keep her safe. Before the rescue party arrived, he had pressed a small silver locket into her palm. Inside was a miniature portrait of a beautiful woman with kind eyes. "This was my mother," he had said. "I want you to keep it, and one day when we are older I will find you again and make you my wife. I promise." She had believed him. She had kept the locket hidden against her heart every day since. But a month after that night, scandal had torn through her family. Her father was accused of treason, the charges false but devastating. The estate was seized. The family name was ruined. Her mother had taken her and fled under the name Gray, and the girl who had once been Lady Alara Vance vanished from society's memory. The boy had searched for her. She would learn only later. He had been told she perished in the fire that consumed her family's manor. He had mourned her. And then he had gone on to become the Duke of Thornwood, a man respected and feared in equal measure, who had married another woman out of duty, lost her to tragedy, and closed his heart forever. Or so she thought. Now, 3 years after her father's death, Alara had been living in a cramped lodging house in a market town, working as a seamstress to keep herself alive, when her uncle, a man who had never shown her an ounce of kindness, arrived with a proposal that made her blood run cold. He had arranged for her to marry Baron Strickland, a man 3 times her age with a reputation for cruelty that was whispered about even in the gutters. The wedding was to take place within the month. Alara had wept and begged, but she had no money, no allies, no escape. Until the letter arrived. It was delivered by a stern-faced steward who wore the Ashford crest on his coat. The Duke of Thornwood, the letter said, was willing to marry her instead. The arrangement would be immediate. The Baron would be paid off. She would become a Duchess, safe and protected, with no questions asked. She had not hesitated. Even the cold charity of a stranger was better than the fate that awaited her with Baron Strickland. She did not know why the Duke would make such an offer, but she accepted. Only when she arrived at Thornwood Hall and saw him waiting at the altar did she recognize the boy from the forest. He had the same dark hair, the same gray eyes that seemed to hold storms. He was taller, broader, his face etched with lines of grief and authority, but it was him. Her heart had soared. She thought wildly that perhaps he remembered her, that this was fate, that he had found her at last. But when their eyes met, his gaze passed over her like she was a stranger, a transaction, a duty to be endured. And on their wedding night, he destroyed her last hope with 4 sentences. The first weeks at Thornwood Hall were a lesson in invisibility. Elara rose each morning with the dawn, determined to perform her role with dignity. She dressed carefully, choosing gowns that were modest but elegant, hoping he might notice. She arranged flowers in the great hall. She asked the housekeeper, a formidable woman named Mrs. Pembroke, how she might assist with the running of the household. Mrs. Pembroke looked at her as though she were a stray cat that had wandered into the pantry. The Duke's first wife, Lady Catherine, never concerned herself with such matters, the housekeeper said, her tone sharp enough to draw blood. She was a true lady. She knew her place. The implication was clear. Elara was not a true lady. She was an interloper, a nobody with a false name, tolerated only because the Duke had inexplicably chosen her. The staff followed Mrs. Pembroke's lead. Maids turned their faces away when Elara passed. Footmen were polite but distant. At meals, the Duke sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, reading letters or staring into the fire, while Elara ate in silence, the clink of her fork against porcelain the only sound. She tried in those early days to reach him. One evening, she asked about the portrait of a young girl that hung in the west corridor. The face was delicate, with dark curls and a wistful smile, and it reminded her oddly of her own reflection as a child. Aldrich's expression shut like a slammed door. "That room is not to be entered," he said coldly, "and you will not ask about it again." She apologized, her cheeks burning, and did not speak for the rest of the meal. Another time, she found him in the library late at night, staring into the flames, a glass of brandy untouched beside him. She hesitated in the doorway, then gathered her courage and stepped inside. "Your Grace," she said softly, "I know this marriage was not what either of us wished, but I would like to be a good wife to you, if you would only let me." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "You misunderstand your position," he said, his voice like the crack of ice on a frozen lake. "You are here because it was the most efficient solution to a problem, nothing more. Do not mistake my charity for affection." He walked past her without another word, leaving her alone with the dying fire and the splintered remains of her courage. She stopped trying after that night. It was not a dramatic decision. There was no moment of fury, no tearful declaration. It was simply a quiet, gradual surrender. The flame of hope that had burned inside her since she was 12 years old, the hope that the boy who had promised her the stars would one day return, finally guttered and went out. She began to build a life that did not revolve around him. She started with the gardens. Thornwood Hall had once possessed beautiful grounds, but they had been neglected for years. Wild roses choked the paths. The fountain was clogged with dead leaves. She asked the groundskeeper for tools, and each morning she went outside, tied her skirts and worked with her hands until the soil was embedded under her nails and her muscles ached with satisfying exhaustion. She discovered in the process that she was good at it. The earth did not judge her. The roses responded to care. One by one, the tangled beds began to bloom again, spilling color into the gray estate. The staff noticed. Some of the younger maids began to offer hesitant smiles. The cook, a plump woman with a kind heart, started leaving a vase of fresh flowers on the kitchen table each morning, cuttings from the garden Alara was reviving. And then Alara began to venture beyond the estate walls. The village of Thornwood was small and poor. The families who lived there had seen little kindness from the great house in recent years. Alara started visiting, at first simply to escape the oppressive silence of the hall, but soon because she found purpose in it. She met children who had no shoes, elderly widows who had no one to fetch their water, a young mother whose baby was sick and who could not afford a doctor. Alara did what she could. She brought food from the estate kitchens. She sat with the sick. She listened to their stories, and she never once mentioned her title or demanded deference. Word spread. The new Duchess, they said, was not like the old one. She had a gentle heart. She was one of them. It was in the village that she met Julian Ashworth. He was the local physician, a man of perhaps 30 with kind brown eyes and a quiet manner. He had come to Thornwood 3 years before, after the death of his own wife, and had dedicated himself to serving the poor. He was the first person in months who spoke to Alara as though she were simply a human being, not a problem to be managed. "You have blisters on your hands," he observed one afternoon when she had come to his surgery seeking medicine for the young mother. He glanced at her palms with professional concern. "Your Grace, you must let me tend to those. An infection can be dangerous." She laughed, a sound that felt foreign in her throat. "I earned them honestly. The roses at the hall have thorns." He insisted on bandaging her hands, his touch gentle and impersonal, and as he worked he spoke to her about the village's needs, the children's health, the hope that spring would bring fewer fevers. She found herself visiting his surgery more often, not for herself, she told herself, but to coordinate charity. She helped him organize a small infirmary. She learned the names of every patient. She began to feel, for the first time since her father's death, that she had a reason to exist beyond the cold walls of her marriage. It was on a crisp autumn afternoon, 3 months after her wedding, that the first crack appeared in the Duke's indifference. Alara had returned from the village, her cheeks flushed with cold, a basket of herbs over her arm. As she crossed the courtyard, she saw Aldrich standing near the stables, speaking with his steward. He looked up, and his eyes followed her for a long moment. Something flickered in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or confusion, as if he were seeing her for the first time. She curtsied politely but did not approach. She had learned that much. Later that day, Mrs. Pembroke informed her that the Duke had requested her presence at dinner that evening. "He specifically asked for you, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her tone suggesting deep disapproval. Alara's heart gave an involuntary flutter, but she crushed it down. She would not hope. She would not make that mistake again. At dinner, Aldrich was silent, but his eyes kept returning to her. She ate her soup and did not speak. After the meal, as she rose to leave, he said her name. "Alara." It was the first time he had spoken it since the wedding. She turned back. "The gardens are looking well," he said stiffly, as though the words cost him something. "The staff tells me you have been working in the village." "I have," she said quietly. "The people there need help. I hope I have not overstepped." He was silent for a moment. "You are the Duchess. You may do as you wish." The permission, grudging as it was, felt like a gift. She nodded and left the room before he could see the tears that pricked her eyes. She did not understand why his small acknowledgment should hurt more than his cruelty. The autumn ball was a tradition at Thornwood Hall. Every year, the Duke opened the great ballroom to the county's gentry, a gesture of prestige that he had maintained even through the years of his mourning. Alara dreaded it. She had no friends among the guests. She knew what the whispers would be: the impostor Duchess, the penniless bride, the woman the Duke had married for reasons no one could fathom. But she dressed carefully, choosing a gown of deep blue velvet that brought out the color of her eyes, and she descended the staircase with her head held high. Aldrich was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He did not offer his arm. The guests began to arrive. Alara stood beside her husband, greeting them with practiced politeness, enduring the curious stares and the barely veiled insults wrapped in silk and smiles. And then Lady Margaret entered. She was everything Alara was not. Tall, golden-haired, perfectly poised, with a diamond necklace that sparkled like captured stars. She had been, rumor said, the woman everyone expected Aldrich to marry before he had inexplicably chosen a nobody. She swept into the ballroom as though she owned it, and her eyes went directly to the Duke. "Aldrich," she said, her voice a caress, "it has been too long." He took her hand and kissed it. "Margaret, you look well." Alara felt herself become invisible. For the next hour she stood on the edge of the ballroom, watching her husband dance with Lady Margaret. They made a stunning pair, his dark elegance contrasting with her golden radiance. The guests murmured approvingly. Some glanced at Alara with barely disguised pity. She did not cry. She did not leave. She simply stood, her back straight, her expression calm, and let the humiliation wash over her like cold water. When Lady Margaret's dance finally ended, Aldrich did not return to his wife's side. He remained with Margaret, speaking quietly, his head bent toward hers. Alara turned and walked out of the ballroom. She did not go to her chambers. She went to the garden, the one place where she felt she belonged, and she sat on the stone bench beneath the old oak tree and let the night wrap around her like a shroud. It was there that Julian found her an hour later. He had been invited to the ball as a courtesy, but he had arrived late. He had seen her slip away, and something in her face had made him follow. "Your Grace," he said gently, approaching with a lantern, "are you unwell?" She shook her head. "I am only tired, Dr. Ashworth, tired of pretending." He did not press. He simply sat beside her on the bench and offered his silent company. After a while she said, "Do you ever feel that you have lost something you never truly had?" He considered the question. "Every day," he said quietly. "But I have also found that sometimes what we think we have lost was never ours to begin with, and sometimes what we need is already waiting for us if we have the courage to see it." She looked at him, and in the lantern light his eyes were warm and steady. Neither of them noticed the figure standing at the edge of the garden, watching. Aldrich had come looking for her. He had seen her leave the ballroom, had felt a strange twist of unease. He had followed her into the darkness, and now he stood in the shadows, watching his wife sit with another man, watching her smile at him with a softness she had never shown her own husband. Something cracked open inside him. It was not jealousy, not yet. It was something rawer, a recognition, perhaps, that he had driven her away so thoroughly that she had stopped even hopping for his regard, and in her absence someone else had filled the space he had abandoned. He turned and walked back to the house, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. That night he did not sleep. The weeks that followed were a slow, torturous shift. Aldrich began to notice things he had ignored before. He noticed that the staff spoke of the Duchess with growing affection. He noticed that the gardens, which had been dead for years, were now bursting with late-blooming chrysanthemums. He noticed that Alara no longer sought him out, no longer asked him questions, no longer looked at him with that fragile hope that had once flickered in her eyes. She was polite, distant, perfectly correct. And she spent more and more time in the village. He found himself standing at the window, watching the road, waiting for her to return. He found himself asking the steward questions about her activities, then pretending he did not care. He found himself lying awake at night, replaying the image of her sitting in the garden with the physician, her face softened by lantern light. He had told himself for months that he was protecting her. He had married her to save her from Baron Strickland, yes, but he had kept her at a distance because he was terrified. He had lost his mother when he was a boy. He had lost the girl in the forest, the girl who had haunted his dreams for years. He had lost his first wife, Catherine, to a riding accident 6 months after their marriage, a marriage he had entered out of duty, and from which he had felt nothing but relief. He had begun to believe that love was a curse, that anyone he allowed himself to care for would be taken from him. And so when he had discovered through a network of informants that the girl from the forest was alive, that Alara Vance had not died in the fire but had been living in poverty, renamed and forgotten, he had acted out of sheer instinct. He had arranged the marriage to save her from the Baron. He had brought her to Thornwood. But he had not been able to bring himself to tell her who he was, who she was to him, because to do so would be to admit that he loved her, that he had loved her since the night he found her shivering under an oak tree, and that love, in his experience, was a death sentence. So he had been cruel instead. He had pushed her away, convinced he was protecting her from a fate worse than neglect. And now he was losing her anyway. The breaking point came on a gray December afternoon. Alara had gone to the village early that morning to help Julian with a sudden outbreak of fever. She had not returned by dusk, and a cold rain had begun to fall, turning the roads to mud. Aldrich paced the great hall, his agitation growing with every passing minute. Mrs. Pembroke observed him with narrowed eyes but said nothing. Finally, he could stand it no longer. He ordered his horse saddled and rode out into the storm. He found her in Julian's surgery, her sleeves rolled up, her hair escaping its pins, her face pale with exhaustion. She was holding a crying child while Julian prepared a poultice. When she looked up and saw Aldrich standing in the doorway, soaked and wild-eyed, her expression shifted from surprise to something unreadable. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "is something wrong?" "You should have returned hours ago," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "The roads are dangerous." "The child needed me," she said simply. "Dr. Ashworth and I have been working since dawn. I could not leave." Julian looked between them, sensing the tension. "Your Grace, the Duchess has been invaluable. Without her, we would have lost several patients today." Aldrich's gaze flicked to the doctor, and for a moment something dark and possessive flared in his eyes, but he controlled it. "I will escort you back," he said to Alara. She looked as though she wanted to argue, but instead she simply nodded, rinsed her hands, and gathered her cloak. They rode back to the hall in silence, the rain pounding against the carriage roof. Alara sat with her hands folded, staring out the window. When they arrived, he helped her down, his hand lingering on hers longer than necessary. She pulled away quickly. That night he could not stay away from her. He went to her chamber, the same chamber he had entered on their wedding night when he had delivered his cold decree. He knocked, and when she opened the door, her hair loose around her shoulders, her dressing gown wrapped tightly around her, he saw the wariness in her eyes. "May I come in?" he asked. She hesitated, then stepped aside. He stood in the center of the room, uncertain how to begin. He had commanded armies. He had negotiated treaties, but he had no words for this. "Alara," he said finally, "I have done you a great wrong." She said nothing. "When I married you, I told you I would never love you. I believed it was the truth, but I was a coward. I was afraid of losing you the way I lost everyone else who ever mattered to me." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You lost me long before you married me, Your Grace. You lost me when you chose to treat me as a stranger." "No," he said, his voice cracking. "I never forgot you, not for a single day." She went still. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small velvet pouch. From it, he withdrew a silver locket, the twin of the one she had kept hidden against her heart for 12 years. Her breath caught. "I found you in the forest when you were 12 years old," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I promised you I would find you again. I searched for you. I was told you were dead. And when I finally discovered the truth, that you were alive, that you were in danger, I married you to save you. But I was too afraid to tell you. Too afraid that if I let myself love you, you would be taken from me again." Alara's hands were trembling. She reached up and unclasped the chain around her own neck, revealing the locket she had kept hidden beneath every gown she had worn since arriving at Thornwood. She opened it, and the miniature of his mother gazed up at him. "I have worn this every day," she said, her voice breaking. "I knew who you were the moment I saw you at the altar. I thought you had forgotten me. I thought I was nothing to you but a burden." Aldrich crossed the room in 2 strides. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had begun to fall. "You were never a burden," he said fiercely. "You were the light I was too blind to see. You were the promise I made under the stars, and I have spent 12 years trying to find my way back to you. Forgive me. Please forgive me." She looked at him, at the man who had broken her heart, who had ignored her and humiliated her, but who was now kneeling before her with tears in his eyes and her childhood locket trembling in his hand. And she realized that forgiveness was not a single moment. It was a choice, made again and again, and she was willing to begin. "I forgive you," she whispered. He pulled her into his arms, and she felt the tension drain from his body, felt the shudder of relief that ran through him. He held her as though she were the most precious thing in the world, and for the first time since she had entered Thornwood Hall, she felt safe. In the weeks that followed, Aldrich Ashford became a different man. He did not change overnight. The shadows did not vanish from his eyes, and there were still nights when he woke from nightmares, reaching for her in the darkness to make sure she was still there. But he was gentle. He was present. He walked with her through the gardens, listening as she named every flower. He accompanied her to the village and helped her build a proper infirmary, funded entirely from the estate's coffers. He dismissed Mrs. Pembroke with a generous pension, and hired a housekeeper who treated the Duchess with the respect she deserved. Lady Margaret, when she next visited, found herself politely but firmly excluded from the inner circle. The Duke's eyes now followed only one woman, and everyone in the county knew it. Julian, to his credit, accepted the change with grace. He remained a friend to both of them, and he continued to serve the village with the same quiet dedication. Alara would always be grateful for the kindness he had shown her when she had no one else. On the anniversary of their wedding, Aldrich took her back to the forest. They walked the same path she had wandered as a child, beneath the same ancient oaks, and when they reached the tree where he had once wrapped his coat around her shoulders, he stopped. He cupped her face in his hands, the way he had done on the night everything changed, and he looked at her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "I made you a promise here," he said. "I told you I would find you and I would make you my wife. I kept that promise, but I did it badly. Let me make a new one." She held her breath. "I promise to love you," he said, "every day for the rest of my life. I promise to see you, to honor you, to never let you feel invisible again. I promise to be the man you deserve, not the man I was." She smiled, the first full, unshadowed smile she had given him since she was 12 years old. "I promise to love you too," she said. "Even when you are impossible, even when you forget, I will remind you." He kissed her then, beneath the canopy of leaves, with the locket warm against both their hearts. And in Thornwood Hall, for the first time in many years, there was no cold silence. There was laughter. There was light. There was the quiet, steady rhythm of 2 hearts that had spent too long apart, finally beating in time. The roses in the garden bloomed all year long, as if the very earth knew that love had returned. And in the village, the people told the story of the Duchess with the gentle hands and the Duke who had learned to love her before it was too late. They told it to their children, and their children told it to theirs, and it became a tale of hope whispered on winter nights, a reminder that even the coldest heart can thaw, and even the deepest wound can heal, and even a promise made in childhood, long forgotten, can still be kept.